Kings and queens are undoubtedly one of the most fundamental aspects of English and later British history. Our monarchy is one of the oldest on earth and without question the most famous. A big reason for that is the colourful cast of characters who've sat on the throne over the past millennia and a half. A question we often ponder is who was the best, the most successful, and conversely, who was the worst. But what if we approached it differently and asked which monarchs are grossly overrated and which, for various reasons, are repeatedly underrated? Well, to discuss this question precisely, I'm thrilled to welcome Dr. Tim Hames onto the podcast to discuss his book, Measuring Monarchy, the most overrated and underrated British kings and queens. Was King Stephen really all that bad? Why should we not throw so much love King Richard I's way? And was Gloriana, Queen Elizabeth herself, all that she's cracked up to be? Welcome back to the Tudor Chest podcast, episode 102, Measuring Monarchy, the most overrated and underrated British kings and queens, with Dr. Tim Hames. Welcome to the Tudor Chest podcast. Tim Hames, how are you doing?
I'm doing very well, sir. Thank you.
Thank you very much for coming along. You're here to talk about your book that was released earlier this year, Measuring Monarchy, the most overrated and underrated British kings and queens, which I've read. I loved. It's great fun because, as the title suggests, you're looking at many of our kings and queens and deciding, are they overrated, are they underrated? And because of that, I'm sure that there's going to be a few characters that we discuss that can be a bit contentious, which is always fun. Before we get into that, though, a few questions to get to know you a bit better, if that's okay. So could you provide me with a short introduction to your background and what it is that you do full time?
Okay. My first career was as an academic. I taught politics, American politics and British politics at Oxford University. And then a combination of poverty and ego, I hope it was in that order, led me to leave academia and join the Times newspaper, where I was an assistant editor. I used to write the leaders. I was the chief leader writer, which meant writing across an incredibly broad spectrum of subjects, depending on what the news of the day was, including the allegedly humorous leaders at the bottom. I also used to occasionally, actually more than occasionally, used to edit the newspaper as a whole on Sundays for Mondays. And this was partly because editors themselves do not want to work on a Sunday for a Monday, and partly because I was deemed sufficiently proficient at football to oversee the game, which was then the main sports supplement on a Monday morning. And partly as a result of the pandemic, I decided I didn't actually want to go back to doing 5 days a week in a single job in a single place. I wanted to be plural, as is quite voguish. So these days, I write books both about history and about politics.
So was there something when you were younger or earlier in your career that, I suppose, sparked a passion for royal history? Because your book is ultimately it's an examination of royalty, I suppose, in all its facets. So was there something earlier on that made you interested in that part of British history in particular?
I think it's partly generational, if I'm absolutely honest. I was 60 earlier this year, and when I was at school, when we were first taught history was taught very much through kings and queens, including a number of characters who I rather turn against in my own book. But and when I did A-level history, it was Tudors and Stuarts on one side, and continental European history very much for the equivalent period on the other side. So I guess I kind of was of a group of people who thought British history started and possibly even ended with kings and queens, at least until relatively recently.
I see, okay. And a couple more sort of fanciful questions now, I suppose. If you could jump in a time travel machine, you had the opportunity to witness a single moment from history, what would it be?
I think it would be fascinating to have a balcony seat, if such a thing is possible, on a battlefield at Bosworth Field in 1485, because it's become so seminal as a moment in our history that in retrospect, the point at which we deem the Middle Ages to end and the early modern age to begin, because history is always written by the winner. You wonder whether all of the accounts of what occurred on that fateful day are 100% accurate. So I think being in a position to actually see what was, after all, something of an upset victory for Henry Tudor would be absolutely fascinating.
I couldn't agree more. And if you had the opportunity to ask a single question to just one of the kings and or queens detailed in your book, what and who would it be?
That's a very difficult question, and one I've sort of pondered upon. I guess, even though I'm quite critical of aspects of her, Elizabeth I would be fascinating to talk to. And I'm particularly interested in an area which I highlight, but which on the whole gets brushed over in most accounts, which is when she was very ill in 1562 with smallpox.
Yes.
And many in her immediate circle seriously thought she might die. And that triggered the mother of all succession crises, which she appears to be, even though she must have known that she was very ill, reluctant to intervene in. Or to indicate a preference for, and indeed had painted herself into a corner rather as to what to do. So I would be quite kind of interested in talking through her through that period, very early on in her reign. But of course, if she had died of smallpox, we wouldn't think of her in anything like the way we do it now. There'd be no debate about Elizabeth I as a monarch.
Yeah, it's a funny one, isn't it? That there are examples of monarchs where I think they ultimately died. They didn't reign long enough in order to stamp out. I think Queen Mary the First, for example, as a monarch, just didn't have enough time,
Yeah.
actually. And when one looks at what she, take the burnings aside, which are obviously indefensible, but when you look at what she was also trying to achieve, Elizabeth actually inherited many of the things that Mary set in motion. So there is sometimes that thing, isn't there, when you look at a monarch's tenure and wonder what could have been had they lasted longer.
I think that's very fair. And of course, with Mary, the annulment originally of her the mother's marriage meant that she was not much of a marriageable proposition herself.
Yes.
When she was prime time for this sort of age where you would normally have expected her to contemplate marriage and have the opening for children. And so, in a sense, her whole life was skewed by the fact that her legitimacy being questioned, and then the question of the succession after Edward VI was so convoluted.
So, to get to your book, Measuring Monarchy, as I said at the start, the most overrated and underrated British kings and queens. At the very, very start of the book, you talk about an idea. Well, the idea for the book, really, the sort of kernel of the idea, began 24 years ago with a BBC Radio 4 poll.
Yeah.
So talk me through what was happening there.
Sure. Well, at the time, I was both the comment editor and chief leader writer and a columnist at the Times. Mr. Murdoch knows how to get his money's worth out of people. And I used to write a column on Monday mornings, full Monday mornings, which is normally about politics. But this was the sort of period between Christmas and the New Year when there wasn't much politics about. So I was searching for an idea. The Today programme clearly had a similar quandary in that they had decided to fill in this sort of dead air time by holding a poll of their listeners as to who was the best king or queen ever, with the justification being that we were about to enter the year 2002 and the golden jubilee of Elizabeth II. And so they put forward this shortlist of Alfred the Great, Henry VIII, Elizabeth I, Victoria, and Elizabeth II herself. I thought it was a bit hard on the Queen being thrown in like that, but anyway. And it made a bit of a splash because, frankly, there wasn't much else out there, but also because one or two members of the Cromwell Society decided to get extraordinarily cross about the fact that their man wasn't on the shortlist. Now, I thought, well, hang on, he wasn't a king. He didn't want to be king. He turned down the chance to be king at least twice.
Yeah.
What on earth are you getting hot and bothered about? But what I suspect was they wanted him to be on the shortlist as a device for sort of casting a protest vote against monarchy as a whole in this rather curious poll. So I wrote a column and said, look, the real problem with this poll, though we do appreciate it is sort of, it isn't meant to be desperately serious, is that no one's been given any sort of steer as to what sort of measurements kind of tell you whether someone's been a good monarch rather than just a famous monarch. So I have put forward three kind of metrics, if you like, business school style, which were public finances. Did they leave the treasury with more money or less money than when they started, foreign policy and diplomacy, and how well they had planned for or left behind the succession. And on that basis, I argue that none of the people on the that Elizabeth II shouldn't be on the shortlist because she was the reigning monarch and it's a bit unfair. But none of the other four actually ticked all those boxes.
Yeah.
And if you wanted to find somebody who did tick those boxes, it was actually Henry VII, and that he was therefore, in many ways, if not necessarily the greatest, almost certainly the most skillful King of England.
So introduce the book for me, Measuring Monarchy. You've sort of already outlined there three of the metrics, but you, with Measuring Monarchy, you end up landing on five. Introduce the book for me, and then what were those additional metrics that you came up with?
Sure. And indeed, the additional two were really, to be honest, the trigger for writing it, because I couldn't see a full book's worth based on those original three. And the two additional ones are professional standing, what other members of the elites thought of you as a monarch or thought of the person concerned as a monarch, and public opinion. And you might say, well, how do we judge public opinion sort of centuries back when there was no such thing as kind of online polling? Actually, one very, very good measure for public opinion is the level or not of disorder. And actually, the English are quite meticulous in keeping kind of records of relative propensities towards riots and dissatisfaction. So I think it is possible, using that as a sort of primitive but not irrelevant indicator, to have some sort of sense about what the public thought of the monarch of the day as well.
I see. Okay. So you have a number of kings and queens that you explore the reigns of, and we'll come to that shortly. But you also chose to not put in several very well-known names from history: King John, King Edward II, the aforementioned Queen Mary I. You didn't put them through further examination. So how did you decide who wouldn't be featured?
Well, I decided that those where there was, to my mind, a reasonable consensus to where they already ranked, were probably less interesting to take on. I mean, being the 103rd millionth person to say that King John could have done a better job didn't strike me as particularly original. Or that, Edward I was a pretty effective hammer of the Scots, etc. So I was more interested in trying to tease away at this notion about the distinction between fame and effectiveness, which I think is often blurred. And I am well aware that if I meet a mysterious death at any point between now and Christmas, it will be because a very strong fan of either Queen Victoria or Queen Elizabeth I has bumped me off. So I want this on public record now. I'm also expecting to be attacked from the sort of Guardian Easter wing as a misogynist, because I am sceptical about both of those monarchs, despite the fact that I am probably Queen Anne's greatest living fan, as somebody who I think was a very, very, very badly underrated monarch. And I think I've been pretty friendly, but for slightly different reasons usual, towards Elizabeth II. But nonetheless, I'm expecting to get it in the neck from the Guardian lobby from that side. And I expect to get in the neck from the Daily Mail lobby for having a go at the likes of Richard I and Henry V, because they were glorious, glorious kings, weren't they? And me saying, but they bankrupted the country, and one of them left no heir at all, and the other one left a 9-month-old son after needlessly getting himself involved in a military skirmish in France that there was no logic in the king being at.
I suppose ultimately what we're landing on then is that you have chosen the monarchs throughout British history who, simply put, yes, overrated and underrated, but they're in the ones that don't sit within that, the ones that are, I suppose, just ultimately useless or bad, people like John, or ones that are deposed very quickly like Lady Jane Grey or Edward V, or ones that are just average. I suppose they aren't taken into consideration for that very reason. What you're examining here is the ones
Yeah,
where you've going, I don't actually understand why there is such hype, and conversely, these monarchs were far better than we've been led to believe.
sure. But in the introductory chapter, as you will recall, Adam, I do sort of go, try and look at the monarchs as a whole, and say, look, there are plenty of monarchs who most people would be happy to put into a bucket labeled either good, average, poor, or terrible.
Yeah,
And to be terrible, you've actually got to be so bad people actually depose you. I mean, that's
yeah,
a pretty good indicator of being terrible. So even King John doesn't quite make terrible. I mean, he
no,
makes poor. He wasn't actually deposed. But as I say, I think I mean, yeah, if you were trying to evaluate all 42 monarchs, um, since from William the Conqueror, taking William III and Mary as two separate monarchs for the sake of argument in this instance, rather than sort of fusing them together as one human being. A, it would make for a rather long book, and B, it wouldn't really be drawing out what I'm trying to do, which is get a debate going around metrics, around yardsticks, around measurements. And one of the reasons why I'm keen to do that, well, the two main reasons. Firstly, I do both history and I do politics. Comparative politics is all the rage within politics, frequently to an almost ludicrous extent that we compare things that aren't comparable.
yeah,
Historians seem to be much more cautious about about comparative history than political scientists are about comparative politics. And that may be right, but I'm interested in sort of testing the proposition as to what you can do with that. But I'm also interested in it because if you can get a degree of consensus, not necessarily around my metrics, although some of them seem to me to be pretty robust,
yeah, I would agree.
but metrics as a whole, it seems to me that you could then use that technique beyond monarchy. You could look at American presidents. You could look at British prime ministers. You could, for sake of argument, archbishops of Canterbury or popes.
Yeah,
Succession wouldn't be quite such an issue on that one. But it becomes a methodology for trying to look at leadership as a whole over a long period of time, but wearing the same institutional hat, even though that hat, in this case, a crown, inevitably evolves over time.
yeah. Did you see that documentary that was on a couple of years ago, which the documentary basically explicitly examined, is Donald Trump Henry VIII born again? I mean, did you see it by any chance?
No,
Okay.
it's an interesting one. Donald hasn't had any problems siring male heirs, it must be said.
No. Well, for what it's worth, I think the five metrics that you outline are perfectly encapsulate how we should be measuring monarchy because they straddle both the job, but then also what the perception of the job is. Even though, one could argue that it's not even arguable what Alfred the Great had to do to what Charles III has to do. It's not so much a sea as an ocean between them in many respects. Well, your book, it does go all the way up to Queen Elizabeth II. For purposes of not keeping you here for 6 hours, and because of the overall theme of the podcast, we're actually going to go up to the point of Elizabeth I in this discussion. Now, the first monarch you examine is King William I, and better known, of course, by his sobriquet of William the Conqueror. Before you really go into that, though, you do kind of expand on this quirk that drives me mad, which is that Brits have this. We seem to have adopted William as the first English king. Now, why is this fundamentally wrong?
Well, it's a curious decision, really, to be honest. I mean, first of all, we're starting our history with what is unquestionably a defeat for the Anglo-Saxons in 1066, and then one followed by a sort of degree of elite ethnic cleansing, really unknown until very, very recent times. I mean, the English had little to be wild about the Normans, and yet somehow we've decided that because he won, he must be one of us, or somehow magically became one of us after his victory, despite the fact that Normandy was the core of his life's mission. From 1066 onwards, England was a nice piggy bank in many ways to have. So it is
Hmm.
strange. The counter argument is, well, draw the line somewhere else. Well, you could go earlier. Alfred the Great wouldn't be an appalling place to start, or you could go later and argue that the Tudors are really the first British rather than uniquely English monarchy since the Anglo-Saxons fell. Um, that's a an argument you can make stand up. But there aren't actually many countries whose kind of history and kind of national starting point is a defeat. The Serbs are one. Tweeted back to I think Blackbird Fields in 1389 from memory. So it is strange.
And it's the little things can also have a really big part of that. I mean, one of them is regnal numbers. If we look at, King Edward the First, he was actually the fourth Edward of
Mm.
England, but he's Edward the First because he is the first Edward given a regnal number, which only came in after the Conqueror. And that alone, if regnal numbers dated further back, I think it wouldn't feel so alien, this kind of pre 1066, post 1066. But just that fundamental, quite simple thing can actually be quite a
Yeah.
big divider, can't it?
And quite right, I agree. And of course, we anglicize everything. I mean, 25 years or so ago, Professor Norman Davis, of whom I'm an enormous fan, produced this book about this big called The Isles, in which he uses the names that the monarchs themselves would have used of the time. So
Hmm.
it's not William, it's William.
Guillaume,
And it's
or
not John, it's Jean.
yeah,
And by using that methodology, you can see the point at which the monarchy of England becomes a monarchy of the English, and
yeah.
it's quite late.
So you ultimately conclude that William the Conqueror, William the First, is your first up, and you conclude he is an overrated king. So
Yeah.
what led you to deciding that?
Well, it's the one I have most anguish over using the term overrated, in the sense that um, if you want someone to be an absolutely effective, ruthless harrier of the English and Anglo-Saxon society, then I suppose he's not been overrated. But if you kind of stand back from that and think again using the metrics, I mean, what did other professional elites think? Well, it depends whether they were for or against the conquest, wasn't it? I mean, those who assumed the property and the titles of those who've been displaced probably had a different view. It's very little to suspect that English public opinion was wild about William the Conqueror.
Yeah,
He used the country really, as I alluded to, as a piggy bank. He spent most of his time trying to extend his territories in France, and he ended up with what he thought was a reasonable solution to his succession issues, that of dividing the spoils between Robert, Duke of Normandy, and William II, England, and well, who became Henry I, a very large financial settlement, only for all of them to fall out over it within 10 minutes of the body going cold. So,
yeah.
on those metrics, then he's not quite the sort of towering figure that his enthusiasts might claim he is.
Next, you examine Stephen. Now,
Yeah.
Stephen is a fascinating one. He's the only King Stephen in history, and I think there's a big reason for that. But you label him underrated. Now, for those who are
Yes.
not very au fait with Stephen's story, why is he controversial?
If you take the view that Matilda, by bloodline, should have been queen, and that being it was perfectly legitimate for a woman to be a queen in their own right rather than a queen consort, then Stephen was clearly a usurper. He made the most of the circumstances of Henry I's death, which came quite quickly and quite unexpectedly.
Hmm.
Stephen was in Boulogne and Matilda was considerably further away. And he got there first, and he
Yeah,
managed to persuade particularly the London community to support him. So Stephen is quite an interesting story and the character in the tale by which Winchester gradually declines and London rises as what's perceived to be the capital city of the country. Um, uh, Now, in fairness to Stephen,
the
the
capital.
rules of the game
Yeah.
around female succession were very messy at this period of time. There were parts of France where, obviously, especially the actual crown of France, where Salic law applied and women. There were other parts of France where it was perfectly all right for women to be the queen.
Yeah.
But the working assumption was, if married, that there'd be a sort of co-rulership arrangement of some sort. And there were other parts of France where it was entirely proper for a woman to reign as herself without any such thing. So the rules were murky. Matilda, not unreasonably, attempted to sort of stake her rights. At one stage in 1141, she more or less had the game over. Stephen had been captured in battle, and she was advancing on London in order to be crowned at Westminster Abbey. But it turned out that London remained thoroughly hostile to her, and that failed, backfired. But her key allies, Robert of Gloucester, then gets captured in battle and has to be swapped for Stephen, and he gets back in the game. But these disputes rumble on for some time afterwards, but over time, Matilda fades out of the scene for her own side, and her son Henry Plantagenet becomes the more plausible contender, and that's pretty crucial to why ultimately that camp emerges victorious, because he was a less contentious, less divisive figure than she was, and especially after his marriage to Ellen of Aquitaine, he was on a roll. I mean, he was a rock star in the early 1150s. He'd gone from nowhere to sudden acquiring Anjou from his dead father and Aquitaine, and the rest of it, and he looked very, very attractive indeed to the English merchant class, as well as the kind of English, if you like, court elites.
Yeah, and I think had Henry I lived long enough for what became Henry II, to reach maturity, I think Matilda would have been out of the equation full stop anyway. I mean, it would have just gone straight to his grandson. And I suppose the other thing that's still not quite set in stone yet, which is also where Stephen can maybe take advantage, is primogeniture is also not fully entrenched yet into the way that the crown is passed from hand to hand.
And that was true for a number of hundred years, afterwards. There was a point where, after the death of the princes in the Tower, if you believed that Edward IV's children should not have been deemed illegitimate, then Elizabeth of York was the contender. She was the one who, by blood, was entitled to run that line. And as we know, Henry Tudor decided to sort of checkmate that one by making a queen consort rather than queen. But there was, even up until the time of Mary Tudor, whether a woman could rule in her own right was not settled in England.
Well, even getting back to the succession around Edward IV's children as well, even if his children were deemed illegitimate, under the laws of primogeniture, Richard III still wasn't the rightful successor. The rightful successor was the children of the Duke of Clarence, George, so Edward, Earl of Warwick, and then Margaret Pole. You ultimately land, though, as I say, on Stephen being a underrated monarch. So what leads you to that conclusion? Essentially
because, in the end, although the very final trigger for it was the death of his son Eustace, who seemed to drop dead age around about 23 in a churchyard which he was plundering. He did agree to a managed settlement, a managed transition between royal houses, which is a kind of one of a kind. Royal houses are either normally turfed out or they die out. They don't actually kind of organize their own orderly demise, as it were. So for that reason, I think that Stephen is harshly treated. I think it's very much the Victorian historians who jump up and down on him, describing this whole period in English history, this sort of almost 20 years between 1135 and 1154, as the anarchy. Well, actually, quite a lot of time there wasn't any anarchy, but there was clearly a fundamental dispute over who was the rightful heir. And after all, Stephen did not only sort of knock Matilda to one side, he actually had an older brother, Theodore, who he is disinclined to make room for. So he's a contentious character, but clearly one who deserves more serious scrutiny than just sort of dismissing him as some sort of sexist.
He's not a character that I know loads about, but what I do know is also that he was, by all accounts, actually quite a nice man. He was quite a decent guy, wasn't particularly cruel. And I suppose because we have this perception of him as being a usurper, snatching a throne, that he must somehow be inherently bad. But there is much more to people than that, and as I say, from what I have read and understand, he was actually quite a competent broadly decent guy for the time.
Absolutely. I mean, he was, I think, because he was more or less adopted by Henry I after his own father
Mm,
died young. His own father went off to the Crusades, didn't like them very much, and came back. His irate wife, fearing humiliation, all sent him back again, where he was promptly killed, as he suspected. So yeah, William is without father, very young age. He was very well treated by Henry I, and there were clearly opportunities in the 1140s when he could have captured and or killed Matilda. And there were at least two occasions when the young Henry Plantagenet came over as a teenager, utterly ill prepared to take him on. There was one legendary occasion where he turned up with a bunch of mercenaries who he couldn't afford to pay. And so Stephen ends up paying them off and sort of packing them back to France again.
that's such a funny moment, isn't it? Because that's literally a teenage boy with just far too much testosterone and confidence bustering in there, and Stephen going like, "All right, on you go, off you
Off
go."
you go, mate. Yeah. Here's 50 quid. No, no, don't come back for another few years, please. Wait till
Yeah.
you can shave.
So good. So next we have that man himself who grows to be King Henry II,
Yep.
generally considered to be the first of the Plantagenet monarchs, and as far as I read it, probably
Mhm.
the greatest, or at least one of the greatest. But you believe he is underrated. So what is it that's driving that maybe poor perception around Henry? Obviously, there is the big thing around Becket.
Yeah, it's a big impact. Yeah. And the extraordinary feuding between him and his sons, often his sons with each other, the sons with the mother with the
Mm,
father. I mean, it is a proper soap opera monarchy. Uh, but I think if you stand back from all that, he was an extremely enlightened and thoughtful administrator, in many ways the father of the common law tradition. He was quite astute in his conduct of foreign policy. He didn't believe in sort of just chucking money down the drain and running around running around France purposely. See, um, in principle, I mean, he prepared well for the succession in that there were plenty of male heirs. It's just said male heirs. Didn't not only fell out with him, they fell out with each other, and they were extraordinarily poor at producing legitimate children or indeed any children. So Henry the Younger predeceases him, childless. Making Richard the next in line, who at that stage was both unmarried and childless, with a younger brother, Geoffrey, who manages to get himself killed during a jousting tournament, whilst his wife is heavily pregnant with what will turn out to be a live child. And then there's John, who again at this time was also unmarried and
mm.
childless. So, I mean, that wasn't Henry II's fault. I mean, he did all that was necessary to sort of put them on the pitch. It's a bit like, many moons later on and past the time we were discussing, George III has 15 children, eight of whom become adult males, and they make an astonishing hash of producing legitimate offspring between them. But you can't really blame the monarch concerned for their failings.
The other character, of course, that's all part of what's going on here as well, and you clearly have a lot of time for this woman, as do I, is how remarkable Eleanor of Aquitaine was as a figure.
I'm very interested in this whole question of missing monarchs. I've got another book I'm finishing writing about people who were heirs apparent who never got there. One of whom is Arthur of Brittany, the son of Geoffrey, yeah,
Oh, Geoffrey.
who ends
Yeah.
up meeting an extraordinarily sticky end, courtesy of King John, possibly even directly as courtesy of King John.
Yeah.
But he was designated the heir apparent by Richard I in 1190 publicly, and then in a treaty in 1191. And only on his deathbed did he revert to John. And that's only because his mother, Eleanor Aquitaine, was with him when he died. And she is the only witness to the fact that he reverted to John on his deathbed. And she was strongly biased. So she was one of the most fantastic, extraordinary. I mean, to have been Queen Consort of France and then to have been Queen
Yeah.
Consort of England for such a long time, and been influential in English court politics all the way up to her death in 1204, is an absolutely
Yeah.
staggering achievement.
Yeah. She was a remarkable figure. I mean, I'm utterly fascinated by Eleanor. I think she's amazing. So, what is it about Henry II then that you ultimately land on? Why do you believe he is underrated?
I do think the Thomas Becket thing has kind of scarred it. And uh, despite the fact that the evidence that he directly ordered his assassination is not strong. It was opportunism by those who thought they were doing his will or would gain his favor. It can't be said that he didn't repent hard enough, despite the fact that he didn't actually do so. As a military figure, I mean, he manages to outwit all of these sort of conniving sons, peeved wives, intervening French and Scottish figures in 1173, 74. So he really is a very, very clever cookie. But I just think that because of the Becket thing, he's sort of tucked away in a little box, which he really should be released from.
I agree. I think was a remarkable king and far outstrips in terms of competence and deserving of our adoration than what came next, which is Richard the First, Richard the Lionheart, and I was pleased to see that you
Yeah.
do label him as overrated. I often feel that the fanfare around him is unjustified. I think because of what came after, which is John, which is obviously very difficult to be any worse than. But this is a king who, I mean, he famously said that he would have sold London could he found a buyer. I
Yeah.
think in his 10-year reign, spent 6 months in England.
6 months. Yeah.
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 So why did he ultimately fail England as a monarch, in your opinion?
Well, he bankrupted the country. The crusade was a mad idea and it failed. When he wasn't on a crusade, he was trying to sort of grab half of France. He engaged. He was extraordinarily reluctant to do anything around succession. And he had this bizarre, nearly 20 years pseudo engagement with a French princess who, in the end, his father appears to have taken in as a mistress to keep the thing ticking over. Then finally gets married because Eleanor Aquitaine goes out to Cyprus and tells him he has to. But there's no hint of an heir coming. And then, as I say, there's this ambiguity to the last about whether the admittedly youthful, I mean, he wasn't yet age of majority, Arthur, or whether John comes next. So I think on kind of all of those metrics, I mean, unless you're really into war for war's sake, that sort of swashbuckling stuff, plus a dollop of a decent portrayal in a Walt Disney cartoon, has sort of and these it's amazing how these things do for you. But no, I mean. Yeah, getting himself kidnapped on the way back from the crusade, and then having to be ransomed for the most eye-watering, gobsmacking sum of money. He comes back within 3 months, he's turned around, he's hoofed it off to France again. I mean,
And especially that his mother had to quite literally cross the Alps with cartloads of gold to pay that
yeah,
ransom. I mean, further evidence of just what a remarkable woman she was. You conclude that King Edward III, the next monarch that you examine, is underrated. A bit like Henry II, I was
yeah.
surprised to see this because I think of him as quite positive. I view him quite positively. So what is it about his reign that you think is maybe perceived as wanting?
I just don't think he has made the impression on public or popular history that I think is merited. I mean, here he is. He's a 14-year-old when he has to participate in the overthrow of his own father, with a sort of slightly more conniving mother than a dubious mother than Eleanor Aquitaine and her lover Roger Mortimer in tow, and yet he outwits all of them. So by the time before his 18th birthday, he has asserted his right to rule in his own right. He's got married and has a son and heir. Edward the Black Prince. I mean, that's not bad going. He was pretty astute with money throughout his reign. Obviously, there were various points. The various high points of the Hundred Years' War were recorded during his tenure, and might have been even higher were it not for the fact that sort of play was interrupted, as it were, by the Black Death for 5 years plus. During that struggle. And plenty of children. Can't be criticised on that front either. Very unlucky that Edward the Black
No.
Prince dies a year before him, who had much to commend him. So I don't think it's that. I think people who seriously think about history won't think of him as underrated, but I think if you were to sort of sit down on 100 reasonably interested members of the public and ask them to list the 10 best kings or queens, I'm not sure how high a percentage you would get. He's just somehow seems to have slightly fallen off our radar screen as a monarch.
Yeah, which is a funny one, isn't it? Because he was a king for so long, 50
Yeah.
years or so. And actually, I think one thing you mentioned there about the fact that he had lots of children, and I think that's where his reign actually stands out in a very positive light is despite these many children, is something that Henry II's reign manifestly fails in, is that Edward III, his children by and large are harmonious.
Yes.
There isn't this infighting. And actually, when I look at Edward III's reign and his children and the way they're deployed, it's almost slightly akin to the House of Windsor, where we have these working royals. There was this large swathe of children of Edward's that worked for the firm, for want of a better term. That's not a harmony we see often in history. There can be an excess of heirs, as was the case with Henry II. But with Edward III, it's quite the opposite. They come together as a family, and that is definitely to be commended.
No, I mean, I think he was very efficient on a number of scores, and as you say, that is rare. I mean, even if you throw forward several hundred years later, God, the House of Hanover hated each other. I mean,
Yes. Fathers and sons.
fathers, sons,
Yeah, there
sons,
was.
brothers, and sons. Oh God, it was all carnage. Yeah, you wouldn't want to be at
Yeah.
a family wedding with that bunch.
Yes, well, I think also sadly for Edward III, what succeeds him, his grandson Richard II, is obviously such a
Yeah.
nightmare that kind of, again, maybe for that reason alone, he kind of slightly pales behind a very dramatic grandson, even though his grandson was useless and probably one of the worst kings in British history.
Yeah, I'm afraid I think he inherited Edward II's genes rather than Edward III's, and that's part of the problem. But
Yes.
again, incredibly bad luck. I mean, because the Black Prince, his health never recovered from being in Spain on that expedition
Mm.
and contracting something. We don't know precisely how unpleasant, but it was pretty unpleasant. And he knew he was near the end. In fact, in 1376, Edward the Black Prince more or less goes on a farewell tour, including visiting his father, saying, "Well, I'm not long for this world." It's all a bit sad and point. I mean, if he had lived to take it on from Edward III. And okay, you would have got Richard at some point, but you wouldn't necessarily have got him as a 10-year-old boy.
Yeah.
You've got him older, and there's every evidence, as you say, because of the relatively close family network, that he might have been educated and trained to be rather better than he turned out to be.
Yeah. Well, the other great irony of the whole thing, I suppose, around this network of children, brothers and sisters that get along very well, these are the people whose descendants break into the Wars of the Roses, which again is, I suppose, the slight irony here that this group of people who were very harmonious, two, three generations, four generations later, they are the ones that are infighting in what spills out into the Wars of the Roses. So, what I'm sure
Yeah.
will be a contentious topic for many is King Henry V, whom you conclude is overrated. So, to counterbalance that for
Yeah.
now, can you summarize why his reputation is broadly so strong
Agincourt,
in a
in a
word?
word. Plus, Laurence Olivier. The 1944 film, which really kind of, I mean, and in those days, cinema attendance, except when the bombs were falling, was extraordinarily high. It's always been as a curiosity that film was made very much with the encouragement of the wartime government of the day to raise national morale. The Henry V film, I say 1944, but isn't it a bit odd that
Mm.
it would have reminded people that our historic enemy was the French and not the Germans? But put it aside. But no, I mean, if you want glorious war leaders, then Henry V is arguably much better than Richard I, in that he didn't go to the ends of the earth in the attempt to be a glorious war leader. The reason for pushing back on him is again public finances kaput, not very much in the country. Arrangements for when he was not in the country, not that fantastic. But the area which I really try and explore and ask questions of, which I think is a little bit novel, is that people sort of feel a bit sorry for Henry V, in that because he died in 1422, shortly before the death of Charles VI of France,
Mm.
then the provisions of the Treaty of Troyes 1420, under which Henry had managed to put himself in as the heir ahead of the person who would eventually be Charles VII, the Dauphin, weren't triggered. And the arguments, well, poor old Henry, if only lived a bit longer, he would have been King of England, King of France, and whoopee-doo. Well, firstly, I mean, he should never have got himself killed where he did in 1422. He went off in a ridiculous military skirmish, chasing a bunch of bandits because they had killed his brother Thomas the year before. I mean, it was just madness. He should never have been there. And therefore dies and leaves the 9-month-old son. But the question I'm really interested in is, okay, supposing that hadn't happened, how on earth was he going to be King of England and King of France simultaneously? I mean, boring stuff like where was he going to live? I mean, what was going to be the
Yeah.
primary part of the empire? Um, there was still going to be a Dauphin, the legitimate heir to the throne, out there, loose. Yeah, but who became Charles VII. He wasn't going to give up. So do you seriously expect the entirety of the French nobility, never mind the French populace, just to accept the fact that Henry V is now King of France and that the Dauphin Charles isn't? Of course not. So it wouldn't have. It would only have settled out, triggered another series of wars in France that, frankly, England could have done without.
Yeah, we see it all literally fall apart in the reign of his son, the extraordinarily inept, but
Yep.
also, clearly mentally unstable Henry VI. All of those lands are pretty much lost, which tells us that it only takes someone who is
Yep.
not militarily competent for it to all fall apart anyway, which also tells you very clearly the lack of loyalty to the English crown across the lands that they'd captured in France.
Yeah. So, I mean, I can understand the sort of, if you like, the kind of Elvis Presley quality to Henry V. Uh, but that's not, again, I think fame and effectiveness are not the same thing.
And I also think there is such a that thing of dying young, when you're dying at your
Yeah.
height, it just has this sort of strange allure to it that sort of maintains that they died as they were. They didn't have the opportunity for it to all go downhill. But that's no sort of barometer, really, is it?
No, I mean, I think I describe Henry V as John F. Kennedy with a lancet.
Yeah.
And I mean, there is an element of romanticism about his life and death. But nonetheless, the consequence was, as you say, a 9-month-old child. That's the youngest um, incoming monarch for England.
Yeah, all
Scotland's obviously
time.
much younger still, 6 days.
Yeah.
And there are very, very few examples of child kings that are not a recipe for conflict and for anarchy and normally for chaos.
Yeah, agreed. So you skip over his son for obvious reasons, and you open your next chapter with King Henry VII, who you conclude as being underrated, and you make a very bold statement, namely that there is a powerful argument for naming Henry the most perceptive and professional monarch ever to sit on the throne of England. So what leads you to that conclusion?
Well, founding dynasties is always hard. Founding a dynasty when your blood claim is less than 100% solid
Tenuous at best.
is particularly difficult, given that there are issues of murkiness and legitimacy questions on both sides of Henry Tudor's lineage. I don't think many people in 1485 thought he would manage to take the hold on the throne that he did. Extraordinarily effective with money, probably the richest man in Europe when he died. Very astute with foreign policy, and in particular, appreciating the rise of Spain before Spain started becoming the cash cow via the New World that it would be. So he was an early talent spotter, if you like, Spain, and with the unlucky twist, very unlucky twist, to the death of his son Arthur, had pretty much put a solid line of succession in place, and appears to be actively engaged in preparing, first of all, his elder son, and then his rather more headstrong second son for the role of monarch.
Hmm.
So I think in many ways there aren't, the only kind of line of criticism of him is he probably wasn't that wildly popular with the public as a whole.
Yeah.
Other than, I suppose, he did draw the line under the War of the Roses, which must have been
Yes.
immensely destabilizing for, even for normal people, with battles taking place every left, right, and centre over that period. So I think he's a really, really class act, but because he didn't have six wives and he didn't have the Armada. He's sort of regarded as this rather boring chap who founds a
Mm.
dynasty with much more interesting people coming afterwards.
I think the thing about Henry VII as well, though, had he not married Elizabeth of York, I think his time would have been, I think he would have had a much, much harder time in establishing his reign. And I think that without the promise of Elizabeth of York, he wouldn't have got nearly the
Yeah,
numbers that he did. But once he does get the throne, to your point, the fact that he is then able
yeah, I
to,
agree with that.
because once he's got the throne and he's married to Elizabeth of York, that's done and dusted. Even with her by his side, he is the king. Unless he's not going to hold on to that throne, even with Elizabeth of York by his side, unless he is a very capable monarch, which he manages to do.
Yeah, and again, it's a story of incredibly important and underestimated, um, powerful female figures. I mean, Henry VII's mother, Margaret Beaufort, had this private line of communication with, Catherine Woodville in the aftermath of Richard's usurping them, and the two of them really cook up the idea that
Mm.
Henry VII, or Henry Tudor as was, should publicly pledge even before he leaves for England that he would marry Elizabeth of York, in the event that he became king, which
Yeah,
part was, I think, partly a smart marketing pitch, amongst other matters. Um, but it does work. And it's she's a rather underestimated figure, Elizabeth York herself. I mean, she wasn't as politically consequential as other queens, partly because Henry VII's mother remained really politically consequential, whilst throughout his reign while she was alive.
mm,
But no, he's just, um, I think he's a sort of, he's a kind of Clement Attlee
yeah,
figure in some ways. He's not as spectacular as some of the personalities around him, but he knows how to run the show, which when you consider that he barely lived in England, until coming here, because much of his life he'd been on the run, it's really very impressive.
yeah. Well, there's even suggestions that he didn't even he spoke with quite a pronounced French accent, I believe. Well, there certainly wasn't much Englishness around Henry Tudor. He was of Welsh origin, raised mostly in Europe. So the fact that he does set up our most famous dynasty and manages to hold on to it is definitely commendable.
And he was the first. I mean, the Tudors were very smart spin doctors, to use a modern term. I mean, so the whole, almost performance around the birth of Arthur, and indeed the choice of name of Arthur. So, poor Elizabeth York is carted off to Winchester, to give birth to him there, because in that era we thought that Winchester was Camelot and Winchester was very close associated to Arthur, and it's quite a clever wheeze, by Henry Tudor, who knows that his own legitimacy, his own Englishness is doubtful, so he kind of like jumps
Yeah.
back, in time almost, and tries to associate with a history before his history. And I think that's quite clever. Just like, Edward the First, who we were discussing briefly earlier. Why was he called Edward? There was no great tradition then. Well, it was an attempt to hark back to Edward the Confessor.
Mm.
It was an attempt to sort of reincorporate an older Englishness into perceptions of the then existing monarchy.
Yeah. Well, I believe that by the time of Edward the First, when he is named that, I mean, Edward was considered a really bizarre name. That people didn't understand where this name Edward was coming from. It was considered a
Yeah.
really, really odd choice, I
Oh,
believe.
you're quite, it's quite correct. It was, yeah, it was certainly, if there had been a Ladbrokes and you'd gone down to bet on the name of the forthcoming monarch's son, Edward would have been a 40 to 1 shot, I suspect.
So obviously, Henry VII has a much more famous, a much larger than life figure succeed him, his son, King Henry VIII. I was not remotely surprised to see that you labelled him overrated, even if he is undoubtedly the most famous king, I think, in British history. So, why do you think he's overrated?
Well, again, just putting through these basic metrics of sort of, he wasn't particularly interested in the governance of the country and sort of outsourced it to, Wolsey, then Cromwell,
Wolsey and Cromwell, yeah.
so, and people knew that. He probably did okay in the court of public opinion, but that's partly because people are so terrified of him. I mean, there were 56,000 executions during his reign.
Hmm.
You got executed for not taking a library book back. There's no king who's come anywhere close to that sort of number. Execution as a sort of kind of automatic part of policy. Um, Obviously, the foreign policy wasn't wondrously connected then, and because of succession issues, we end up with everything we know about the convulsions of English society. There may or may not have been a good case for becoming a Protestant country, but it wasn't to allow him to become his own pope and dissolve his marriage. And in the end, his gambit around Edward VI fails. So
Hmm.
there aren't, as you say, he is larger than life, but I mean that's kind of not really an argument for putting on the pedestal that we do.
No, exactly. And I think the six wives thing is such a big part. Obviously, it is the most famous part of his story, but being married many times is not something that one should say, well, that's a successful reign. He does it out of necessity, but inexorably fails most of the time because
Agree. I mean, if you're going on that logic, Elizabeth Taylor should be remembered as the greatest living actress.
yeah, exactly. And finances as well. I mean, he bankrupted England. I mean, Henry VII
Oh,
leaves
yes,
him with the biggest royal inheritance, I think, of all time up to this stage, and he blows it.
right, and he's blown it comfortably
Yeah,
within a decade. Yeah.
crazy.
Um,
Well, rather like Henry V before, your next conclusion, namely Elizabeth I being overrated, is going to be a
yeah,
contentious one. You raised this yourself
yeah.
earlier, that you're going to get some haters on that. So, can you talk me through the things about Elizabeth's reign that are often lauded, but actually in reality, likely the work of others, and therefore she shouldn't be commended for?
Well, firstly, I mean, I think she's an absolutely admirable character. Um,
Mm,
and she weaves her way through the absolutely shark-infested waters of the politics of the 1550s with commendable skill. She was probably the smartest self-spin doctor of the Tudor set. Quite brilliant at elevating a certain image. So there are many aspects to her which are admirable. However, my argument would be, firstly, and they're interconnected. Her case is the finance, foreign policy, the succession. Um, she basically tried to run the monarchy on a kind of pound land basis, not because she was remotely extravagant, especially certainly compared with her father. She
yeah,
was
make
absolutely
do
not
amend.
extravagant. She was more like her grandfather, but she didn't want to call pot. She didn't want to call parliaments, and she didn't want to call parliaments who would have given her money, but they would, first of all, for the first 15 years of her reign, they would have insisted on a discussion about the marriage question, and then for the next 30 years, they would insist on a discussion about the succession question, and she was deeply reluctant to do that. So as a consequence, she ran the ship on too tight a budget. Um, in many cases, she tried to make up the shortfall by requiring people who held offices under the crown to buy them back again on a periodic basis. How were they going to finance all that buybacking? Well, probably there were levels of corruption under Elizabeth I that were not seen 100 years either side of her. Not because she herself was corrupt, but because she created a culture in which people had to find the money to buy their offices back. And foreign policy for much of her reign was again on the hoof because it was there wasn't the cash to fund it. And where I think she was perfectly entitled to make a sort of stand was on the marriage question. If she had concluded that from fairly early on that all of the options on the
Mm,
table in terms of marriage actually were net negatives for her, and would result in a diminution of power. That was a reasonable
Yeah.
conclusion to come to. I don't have any complaint with her about that. But if you do that, you are compounding a glaring succession issue problem. And you are at least obliged to say, if you're going to say, look, I'm not getting married, thank you very much. You can all bugger off on that one. You do have to make a choice between do you go down the bloodline
Hmm.
or do you go down the line of Henry VIII's will and swap over Mary and Margaret. Um, and this really comes to, as I alluded to in our conversation earlier,
Yeah.
in 1562, she really does nearly die of smallpox. And people around her really thought she could die, and they had no idea what they were going to do next because she wouldn't sort of indicate whether it's going down the bloodline or whether it was still Mary Queen of Scots was so
Yeah.
unacceptable that you went down the other
Yeah.
end, in which case, logically, you got to Lady Catherine Grey. Unfortunately, she was locked up in the Tower of London because Elizabeth had deeply disapproved of her secret marriage to the Earl of Hertford and chucked them in the Tower of London and abolished the marriage and, in effect, illegitimized the
I
children
know.
who you required to be your heirs if you were going to go down that other route. So,
Yeah, and
succession is a bit of a nightmare. And if Robert Cecil hadn't been quite so skillful in the last few years of her life and paved the way for James VI in the way that he did, it could have been a goddamn awful mess in 1603.
yes. Well, I mean, and I think that's therein was also part of the issue. There were just lots of, and I think the thing about Elizabeth the First, and this is a big reason, and this actually came up last week quite significantly in my podcast, she is no feminist. And I think that there is this perception, certainly among modern audiences, that she was this proto-feminist, as was her mother, hundreds of years ahead of their time. These women were not hundreds of years ahead of their time. Far from it. Elizabeth was not a feminist. She upheld patriarchy. She just saw herself as a bit of an exception to the rule. And I think we really also see that in very clearly how much she disliked the female heirs to her throne, of which there were very many, floating about the court. You've
Yeah,
mentioned Catherine Grey. There were several others, Arbella Stewart, Margaret Stanley, that she keeps downtrodden. But the great irony, really, as well, is that she could have gone about it in a different way. She was extremely cautious, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but there is also an argument. Why couldn't she have said, okay, Catherine Grey is my heir under my father's will. Catherine Grey is the heir. She's got these two sons of royal blood. Why couldn't Elizabeth have said, I have no intention to marry. I will not produce an heir of my own, but I name this boy as my successor when the time comes. There was a way they could have gone about it that would have just been smoother, but she never did. And I think therein was part of her magic, but also part of what made her quite a
yeah.
difficult monarch.
Indeed, it was almost a sense that she thought she herself would
Yes.
be devalued by the existence of an heir. That people would be constantly looking in two directions. Um, I don't think that's true. I mean, if you're the queen, and the queen in your own right, you are the show. I mean, there is an interesting sideshow, but Elizabeth II did not have to go through most of her life worrying that people thought about Charles more than they thought
Mm.
about herself, except possibly during some of the more exciting moments of the Charles Diana marriage. But and Henry VII, when we go back to our mutual admiration of, was not spooked by the fact that he had heirs. Quite relaxed. And indeed, this whole question around the Margaret versus Mary thing, and which way round to go, is in a way a slightly sad story because Henry VII had agreed to the Scottish marriage for Margaret in January of 1502 under the
Mm.
Treaty of Perpetual Peace. She didn't actually formally marry till the year afterwards, but that was when the deal was done. And Arthur was still alive then. So he thought, I've got two live son options, Arthur and Henry. Arthur dies 3 months later. And all of a sudden, Margaret and the possibility of Margaret's heirs, entering the frame later down the line becomes much more
Mhm.
real when you've lost
Yeah,
Arthur.
exactly. And I think that was the other complication with that Scottish line as well is that, we don't know the exact reasons why Henry VIII bars the Scottish line. The easiest reason historians will give is they were born outside of England. Some of them weren't. Margaret Douglas was born in England. So it's a very difficult one to try and make sense of hundreds of years later.
And he's wildly inconsistent,
Mm,
isn't he? Because as late as 1545, he's trying to bang the Scots' heads together for this scheme to marry the young Prince Edward to
Queen
Mary,
of
Queen of
Scots, yeah.
Scots. And then 2 minutes later, he's excluding the lot altogether from the succession, which is kind of
It is a funny one.
quite strange.
In the end, do you think, and this is a very trite way of summing her up, but do you think Elizabeth I was just lucky?
Yeah, I mean that is my concluding sense of of Napo I mean, and in a way, you make your luck, um, uh, but we didn't really win in 1588. The Spanish conspired to lose it. If Richard III needed my kingdom for a horse, what Philip II required was a decent meteorologist. It was a complete hash, the Armada, rather than a triumph for kind of English military skill. But you'll make your own luck. Yeah, she was, as Napoleon used to ask of prospective generals, but is he lucky? Well, she was lucky.
So my final question for you then has to be, in your opinion, who are the best and the worst monarchs in British history?
Well, in terms of, I'll try and avoid best and worst. I'll try and more this sort of underrated, overrated thing. Because I mean, I put my cards on the table for Henry VII, very firmly.
Hmm.
I think that Queen Anne is severely underrated.
Yep.
Largely because all that she's remembered for most people is a very, very, very large number of failed pregnancies. Poor woman.
Yeah, 17.
Well, it's an interesting debate now. Is it 17 or 19? Apparently, in some but let's put that to one side. The fact that she was a very unwell woman and was physically enormous by the
Yeah.
time she had to be casted around in a sedan chair. And then she fell out with her best mate, Sarah, Dr. Marlborough, who writes vituperative diaries about her. I mean, just, never mind Prince Harry and Spare. My God, the stuff that she slung at Anne. And yet, dear old Anne, not very well, arguably the most conscientious monarch in terms of paperwork, attending cabinet meetings and the rest of it. Probably the only person who had any genuine passion for the Act of Union out there. Deeply suspicious about how the Act of Settlement 1701 was going to work with these funny blokes coming in from Germany. Thank you very much. So I think she's severely underrated. And in a more modern
Mm.
era, people who I think were surprising successors of kings, although their tenures were short, were both William IV and Edward VII. Um,
Yes, I was surprised to see Edward VII under the
yeah.
underrated banner, but refreshing, certainly, because he is not a king that many people have a good thing to say about.
Well, I mean, I think he was actually rather popular throughout his time.
Mm.
He was very well regarded by people who worked with him at kind of ministerial level. He was again, I think all we had in common with the Tudors, and in terms of spin doctory, he was fascinated by
Yeah.
the new medium of photography and how photography could be used to project not only his image but the image of the monarchy more broadly. He was he was astute like that. He had a very, very caring relationship with both of his sons, but especially the tutoring of George when George finds himself unexpectedly replacing Albert Victor in the line of succession after his death in 1892, aged 28. He does lots of things right, and in many ways is more of the inventor of the modern monarchy than his mother was.
Mm.
He didn't really have the popular touch. He was quite difficult, as we know, with her ministers. She had favourites and she had those who were not favourites. So I think that I think he deserves his place in the sunshine, Edward the Seventh.
It's funny, isn't it? He's one of those kings, I think, that the ones that have a slightly murkier reputation, there also tends to be just sort of one thing people hone in on. And Edward the Seventh is sort of, at least as the way I think it's perceived, he was randy. He had this chair that meant he could sleep with two women at once. But there's much more to people and those sorts of things. And that's, I think, his label is he was just lascivious. But actually, there's so much more.
Yeah, no, no. I mean, he was certainly a playboy in his youth. What else are you supposed to do to fill in the time? I don't think it was anything. And compared with Christ, compared with something Hanoverians, he was positively well behaved. I mean, at least he did bother to get married, and he did
Yeah.
bother to have legitimate children. So he did turn up for the day job. It's just he had a night job as well.
So on the overrated spectrum, then, who do you think is who takes the crown? Excuse the pun.
Well, I think just in terms of the the distinction between fame and effectiveness, I think Henry VIII does take the crown because he is so famous for all these bizarre reasons we've discussed, and yet he really wasn't very good at the job. Yeah, it's a fascinating what if of history. If Arthur had not died in 1502 and had a happy and successful marriage with Catherine of Aragon and had produced heirs, and Henry had gone off and done something else instead, um, would we have had the Reformation in England? Would we have had the dissolution of the monasteries? Would we have had the financial chaos? Would we have had the crises of the monarchy that Henry's inability to produce a healthy adult male leads to? Obviously, the answer is we don't know,
Would
but
all those questions?
it's like a similar interesting what if is the death of Prince Henry, Prince of Wales in 1612, the eldest son of James the First stroke sixth, which means you get the much less well-suited Charles as your heir apparent and not the seemingly rather more well-prepared Henry the Ninth as he would have been. But that's one of the many reasons why history is fascinating and why our podcast is fascinating and these conversations are fascinating, because what ifs take you into a fascinating, completely parallel universe.
Well, and with Henry VIII, the what if around his brother can apply to him perfectly as well. What if he had had sons with Catherine of Aragon? It's perfectly reasonable to conclude, had that been the case, we'd have never known the name Anne Boleyn. She is the most famous, probably the most famous queen consort, certainly in English history. She would have probably been a nobody. There's every argument to say we'd still all be Catholic. Those what ifs are colossal and cannot be ignored.
And if just to round that, I mean, even if you allow for Arthur's death, if Henry had been married to Catherine of Aragon more quickly afterwards, instead of nearly 7 years later, given that she's older than him to start with, so it's slightly running the clock the wrong way. Supposing they'd been married in 1503, and male heirs had been produced, and she did actually have three sons by Henry, but they all died
Very young,
within
yeah.
the first 6 months. One of them lasted long enough for there to be some enormous grand tournaments to celebrate his birth, and then the poor chap died about a week afterwards. Who knows?
Well, thank you very much for coming on the podcast and having this discussion. This has been really fun. I knew this would be a juicy conversation. The book is already out, right? So people can get it on Amazon
Yes.
and across bookstores and everything.
Absolutely. As always, Amazon is probably the fastest way, but some people shoot me for saying that.
Well, thank you very much and speak soon.
Cheers. Love to see you, sir. Thank you.
That brings us to the end of this week's episode of the Tudor Chest podcast. My thanks to Tim for coming onto the podcast, and my thanks to you, the listener, for tuning in each week. If you've got any suggestions for future podcast episodes, please do drop me a message on Instagram at the Tudor Chest. I would love to hear from you. Thank you again for listening to the Tudor Chest podcast, and chat to you next week.